Welcome to this explainer. If you're an undergrad stepping into the absolutely massive world of the humanities, or honestly just someone who wants a rigorous, structured way to understand art, well, you're exactly where you need to be. Today, we're diving into formalism. We're going to equip you with the ultimate critical toolbox so you can dissect literally any work of art, literature, or music like a true scientist. Let's get into it.
Okay, here's our quick syllabus for today. We'll start with an introduction of formalism, trace its origins and historical development, unpack its core concepts and principles, look at its applications across the arts, and then finally, evaluate its strengths, criticisms, and legacy.
Section 1, Introduction to Formalism. To kick off our workshop, we kind of have to completely rethink how we even approach a piece of art.
So I want to challenge your instincts right out of the gate here. When you read a poem, your very first thought might be to look up the author's biography, right? Or maybe the history of the time they lived in. But a strict formalist, they would loudly answer no to whether you need any of that external stuff to understand the art. They argue the text is a totally autonomous, independent island. You don't need the author's diary. You just need the text right there in front of you.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway is that formalists view a work of art as a standalone object. This was a massive shift in literary criticism. Before formalism came along, critics were totally obsessed with moral lessons or trying to psychoanalyze the author. Formalism completely shifts the focus from what is being said to exactly how it's constructed. Basically, they wanted to make the study of literature and art a systematic, hard science.
Section 2. Origins and historical development. So where did this intense, hyper-focused toolkit actually come from?
The development of this theory actually follows a really fascinating linear timeline. It kicks off in the early 20th century with the Russian formalists, specifically groups like the Moscow Linguistic Circle, founded in 1915, and Opiaz in 1916. Their whole goal was to figure out what exact linguistic properties separate literature from just ordinary talking. Fast forward a few decades, and this theory travels over to the West, evolving into what we call Anglo-American New Criticism between the 1930s and 50s.
And here are the masterminds behind our toolbox. You've got the Russian pioneers like Victor Shklovsky and Roman Jakobson on one side, and the American new critics like John Crow Ransom and Cleanth Brooks on the other. The new critics are super famous for emphasizing this idea of close reading. Cleanth Brooks, for instance, argued the poetry gets its true power from paradox, irony, and tension, and he completely rejected the notion that we should care at all about what the author originally intended to say.
Moving on to Section 3. Core concepts and principles. Let's physically open up this toolbox and look at the specific analytical instruments these scholars gave us.
Roman Jakobson, one of those key Russian formalists we just mentioned, was absolutely obsessed with this specific question. What makes a text literary? He wanted to find the exact, undeniable formula that separates high art from just an everyday, passing conversation.
To really grasp this, just look at the difference between mere communication and aesthetic elevation. Saying the sun rose this morning just communicates a basic fact, right? But if you describe that exact same event using figurative language, saying the golden eye of dawn slowly awakened the sleeping earth, you elevate the text above mere communication. That aesthetic elevation, that is what Jakobson called literariness.
And that brings us to a huge concept, defamiliarization, or ostrananie in Russian. This is arguably the heaviest, most important tool in the entire formalist box. Introduced by Victor Shklovsky, the idea is that as we go about our daily routines, we get totally numb to the world. Art exists to make things strange, to slow down our perception so we don't just gloss over reality. It essentially forces us to actually see things again.
For example, consider this phrase, "The beast tore through the wind as though pursued by invisible fire." Instead of just using a generic phrase like "the horse ran fast," Shklovsky shows how a vivid, highly unusual description like this forces you to stop in your tracks. You have to actively process the beast, the invisible fire, the tearing through the wind. You aren't just absorbing information anymore, you're actively experiencing the craftsmanship of the image itself.
Now let's take a quick second to contrast formalism with structuralism, which is a related theory it actually inspired. It's a really vital distinction for you undergrads to make for your exams. While formalism looks at the specific, isolated gears of one single watch, like say the symbolism in one specific folktale, structuralism looks at the broader concept of timekeeping across all of society. Structuralists zoom way out to look at the massive underlying systems and recurring narrative patterns across hundreds of different stories.
So anytime you're assigned a formalist reading in class, you absolutely must adhere to these 5 pillars. 1. You practice close reading. 2. You maintain strict objectivity based solely on the text. 3. You apply systematic, scientific analysis. 4. You treat the text as an objective, unified organism. And 5. Above all else, you focus intensely on the artistic technique, how things like rhythm, rhyme, and metaphor are actually built.
Section 4. Applications across the arts. Let's take our workshop skills and see how this plays out across completely different mediums, because formalism definitely isn't just a trick for dissecting books.
Starting with literature, notice how, whether we're looking at poetry, drama, or fiction, we completely ignore the author's background. If we look at Robert Frost's poetry, we're strictly counting the meter and mapping the rhyme scheme. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, we're diagramming the plot structure and dramatic irony, not psychoanalyzing Shakespeare's childhood. And in a fiction novel like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, we're tracking recurring symbols and narrative voice. It is all about dissecting the craftsmanship.
But this incredible framework extends way beyond the written page, deeply influencing linguistics and oral traditions too. For instance, researchers apply this framework directly to African oral literature. They'll analyze an Igbo proverb for its syntax and phonology, or study Yoruba praise poetry for its rhythmic parallelism, rather than just focusing on its cultural meaning. You're literally analyzing the architecture of the spoken word.
And over in the visual arts and theater, the rules are exactly the same. Even when we look at a highly emotional painting like Van Gogh's The Starry Night, a formalist isn't trying to diagnose his psychology. We're objectively measuring his use of shape, line, spatial balance, and color contrast. Same goes for theater. When studying Wole Soyinka's The Lion and a Jewel, we analyze the stage arrangement, costume design, and performance structure as one unified whole.
Finally, let's talk about music. The formalist ear listens to a masterpiece like Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 entirely differently than a casual listener would. Instead of just letting the music wash over them to feel a certain vibe, a formalist listens strictly to mathematically track its tempo, its harmony, and the development of its recurring structural motifs. Bringing us to Section 5, Strengths, Criticisms, and Legacy. Now that we've taken these tools for a spin, it's time to turn our analytical lens on the theory itself and objectively evaluate the formalist toolkit.
When we evaluate this legacy, a massive core debate emerges in academia. On one hand, formalism is undeniably incredible for providing an objective, systematic appreciation of aesthetic form. It gives you a really rigorous methodology. But on the other hand, critics argue it creates an artificial vacuum. By stripping away context, they point out that it completely neglects historical reality, ignores vital social issues like gender, race, or class, and totally disregards both the author's intent and the reader's emotional response.
And here, we can impartially note a major, tangible limitation of this approach. If you apply a strictly formalist reading to a novel like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, focusing only on its plot structure and recurring metaphors, you might completely miss the profound social realities of colonialism, race, and cultural erasure that are literally the lifeblood of the text. By insisting the text is an isolated island, you seriously risk ignoring the vast ocean of history surrounding it.
But honestly, because of its incredible utility in breaking down how art is actually built, modern humanities scholars haven't just thrown the toolbox away. Formalism remains absolutely foundational in fields like film studies, semiotics, and narratology. Today, most scholars simply combine these structural tools with other critical lenses. So you might use formalist close-reading techniques to gather your evidence, but then view that evidence through the lens of feminism, Marxism, or post-colonialism to get a much more comprehensive, full picture of the artwork.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder as you continue your undergraduate studies. If formalists are right, and a masterpiece is truly an independent, autonomous object built strictly out of aesthetic devices, does it actually owe anything at all to the history and society that birthed it? It's a question that goes to the very heart of how we experience art. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and keep exploring.